Richard Roose perhaps was just the unluckiest chef in English history. When Roose attempted to pull a prank by spiking his master's food. Subsequently, the prank created a bizarre chain of events that would change the course of English history forever. Richard Roose was boiled alive after allegedly poisoning his employer's food. Notably, Henry VIII had only recently passed an act in Parliament that made murder by poison an act of treason, most likely due to his phobia of being poisoned. He was the first man in Britain to be publicly boiled to death. So who was Richard Roose, and why did Henry VIII demand this punishment of a lowly chef? Richard Roose was a chef at the home of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, during the reign of King Henry VIII. The job was quite delicate because Fisher was widely regarded as one of the most learned theologians in the world at the time, and had once been a significant ally of Henry VIII. On February 18, 1531, Richard prepared a large meal for Fisher, catering for around 16 guests, as well as beggars who usually gathered at Fisher's house for alms. Shortly thereafter they all fell seriously ill and 2 people died. It was announced that the soup Richard served them all was poisoned. The only person who didn't get sick from the soup was Fisher himself, who for unknown reasons decided not to eat. The fact that a high-ranking enemy of the king was nearly poisoned was big news. Fisher had supported Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, when he had decided to divorce her, so that he could be free to marry Anne Boleyn. The issue was so important that the king himself intervened. The poisoning at Fisher's house had dire consequences for Richard. He was put on the rack and tortured until he admitted that he had indeed poisoned the soup. He claimed that it was a mere prank to make visitors sick and evacuate their bowels, nothing more. However, King Henry was not satisfied with this. He wanted Richard to face the harshest punishment possible. 2 people were dead and Henry wasn't willing to settle for manslaughter, he wanted more. The only crime worse than murder was treason. The only problem was that Richard didn't commit treason. The solution was to change the meaning of the word treason. Shortly after Richard's confession, Henry asked 2 of his councillors to write a bill expanding the definition of treason. The bill was called the Act for Poisoning and passed both chambers of Parliament with no problems. The bill essentially added 11 new offences under the article High Treason. The main takeaway was the new bill that made murder by poisoning as an act of high treason. Those found guilty were to be burned alive without the so-called favour of the clergy. So why did Henry act so quickly to ensure Richard faced the maximum penalty as possible? He didn't even like Fisher. Maybe his life would have been easier if Fisher had eaten the poisoned soup. Lots of conspiracy theories began to float around. Many people suspected Henry himself had paid Richard to poison the food. It was well known Henry was no longer a fan of Fisher and people assumed Henry wanted him dead. These people suspected that Henry's harsh treatment of Richard was simply an attempt to get rid of the smoking gun before Richard could put the blame on the king. Others believed it was Anne Boleyn's family who wanted Fisher dead. This theory revolves around the idea that it was her family that paid Richard to poison Fisher. Henry's mistreatment of Richard was allegedly an attempt to protect Anne Boleyn and her family from a possible confession that Richard might make. Finally, it was also well known that Henry was terribly paranoid about poisoning in general. Although poisoning was extremely rare in England at the time, Henry had a phobia of being poisoned. No one was surprised that Richard was quickly found guilty of treason. Richard was not tried, he was simply handed an attainder that stated he was guilty. His sentence was carried out on April 15, 1532 in an area of London called Smithfield. Richard was chained and tied to a machine that submerged him in a pot of boiling water 3 times over a period of roughly 2 hours. It was a brutal, drawn-out death that many spectators found uncomfortable to watch. Richard was not the first to be subjected to this form of execution, but it was thanks to him that it was written into the statute book as a valid form of execution. This form of execution was extremely cruel, but it was chosen for a reason. It was intended to reproduce the actual crime of poisoning itself. Richard took the time to add poison to the food by stirring it as it simmered and cooked the food. As such, Richard, a supposedly poisonous element of society, was added to his very own soup. Why was Richard executed as a traitor when his crime was murder of commoners? Whatever the answer you might have, the fact is Richard's death marked a turning point in Henry's reign.